Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. New Yorker staff writer Susan Orlean, hailed as a national treasure by the Washington Post and the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Library Book, gathers a lifetime of musings, meditations, and in-depth profiles about animals in her new collection, On Animals. Susan Orlean has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1992. She is the New York Times bestselling author of 7 books, including The Library Book, Rin Tin Tin, Saturday Night, and, of course, The Orchid Thief. Again, the new collection is On Animals. It's a great pleasure to welcome Susan Orlean back to the book show. How are you?
I'm good. It's so great to talk to you again. It makes me wistful for the Hudson Valley, just hearing your voice.
Many of these stories that you tell take place when you lived in the Hudson Valley and you had a lot more land and you weren't in LA, which I don't typically think of as an animal place.
Right. Well, certainly the fullest flowering of my animal ownership occurred when I was living in the Hudson Valley and had a farm and 50 acres, and it seemed like an almost limitless capacity to have animals. We then began dividing our time between LA and New York. Eventually, and this occurred really just a couple months ago, the travel back and forth became simply too much and too hard to do, in part because we have 2 dogs and a cat, and getting back and forth with the animals became more and more of a challenge. So we sold our house in the Hudson Valley. One thing I have to say though is I imagined LA would be a much more urban experience, but it's turned out a little differently. There is a lot of wildlife in Los Angeles within the city limits. In fact, just the other day, a real honest to God mountain lion walked across our backyard. And this is the thing about Los Angeles is that even though it's an extremely urban area, there is a lot of wilderness within the city limits. When you're living in an area that's more suburban in the sense that it's more houses and fewer apartment buildings, you've got lots and lots of backyards. In the backyard, in my backyard, it's a thriving ecosystem of critters, everything from hawks to squirrels and rabbits and raccoons and skunks, an entire universe of animals, as well as some of the creatures that seem to really enjoy living in Los Angeles, like coyotes.
I do want to get to the body of the collection, but in the introduction, there's just this one page, and I wish it was a whole chapter because I have to think there's more to this story. You're dating this guy. It's Valentine's Day, and then, from my understanding and from my reading, then a real live lion shows up in your apartment.
Yes, this is something that my boyfriend, who is now my husband, the only downside of this experience was that when the next Valentine's Day rolled around, said to me, I don't know, I can't top that. I mean, how can I ever, like, a dozen roses doesn't seem very
No.
interesting once you've brought a lion to someone's apartment. The way this came about is I had met John, and he knew about me that I really loved animals. This was something that emerged very early on in our courtship. And when Valentine's Day rolled around, or I should say, the week before Valentine's Day rolled around, he was actually on a flight somewhere and began chatting with the guy seated next to him. And it came up that this guy was deputized to take care of exotic animals that had been seized from people who had them illegally. So he was one of those people who gets called in when someone is found to have an ocelot in their apartment. and they send the ocelot to him, and eventually it goes to wherever it's going to go. John said to this guy, "Oh my God, my girlfriend loves animals. Do you have an animal that you could bring to our apartment and surprise her?" And the guy said, "Well, I happen to have a 2-year-old lion. I could bring the lion." So John said, "All right, deal." And, I knew nothing about it. He completely misled me in thinking we were going to see The Lion King. But he told me to dress very casually, which I was a little irritated because I felt like I wanted to look pretty. It was our first Valentine's Day together. And he kept instructing me to get into more and more casual clothing. Finally, the doorbell rang and he said, "I'll go get it. You just make yourself comfortable." And he opened the door and I looked up and there was a 2-year-old African lion
Mm.
walking into my apartment. I would say, as a surprise, you can't really do better than that.
No,
It's
that's pretty
it's
good.
just it was amazing.
Let us talk about the stories that are included in the book. Some go back quite a few years, some are much more recent. The theme, of course, is animals, but it also shows that you are drawn to the theme, that when you have the opportunity to write about these subjects, you take it.
Yes, I would say it's a cause and effect that can't quite be separated. My ear is perhaps tuned a little more sensitively to stories that involve animals because I like animals, but also because I feel that animals and writing about them often opens up a lot of themes that are very interesting to me, including the nature of human behavior. Almost none of these stories are about animals that are in isolation from human interaction. Even the wildest animals that I write about have in some way or another interfaced with humanity. And our treatment of and attitude towards animals is a very revealing aspect of who we are. I'm not talking about, do you love dogs and cats? Do you let your rabbit sleep in bed with you? This doesn't pre assume that you are someone who likes animals to live in your home with you. That's not even a requirement of any of these stories. It because the fact is that we all have interaction with the animal world all the time, either overtly or without our knowledge. I mean, just to use as an example, so many medicines and science experiments have involved animals in one way or another. We are all touched by the animal world. The issues of wilderness and habitat affect all of us, and that is connected to the animal world. So this is not a book that is kind of a meditation on how wonderful cats are as pets. It really is about this other universe that is overlaid on the human universe, and the points where we connect most interestingly is what I like to write about.
And in that overlaying with the human universe, these are also very much stories about the animals, but also their people, the people whose lives are intertwined with them.
100%. This could have been called On Humans as easily as it was titled On Animals, because the human animal is present in every story. And the fact is that writing about animals gives you a chance to have a different and sometimes fresher perspective on the human world. I mean, for instance, I'm very interested in oxen and curious about oxen and farming with oxen and their use. And I was very surprised to discover, because it's a rarity, certainly in the United States. It's a hobby for a certain number of people, but generally speaking, we don't farm with oxen anymore. In Cuba, however, it emerged that farming with oxen suddenly became a very important ability because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Do you think, what? How does the collapse of the Soviet Union lead to oxen being on the uptick in Cuba? Well, as I said, our world is not separate from the animal world. And tractors had been used widely throughout Cuba. They had been supplied by the boatload
Mm.
by the Soviet Union and powered by cheap gasoline that was being gotten from Venezuela. And then the Soviet Union collapsed and cut Cuba off of this largesse that had been providing not only tractors, but tractor parts for repairing tractors. And then gas prices went up. And suddenly, operating a tractor became a difficult thing for somebody who didn't have a lot of money, and access to gasoline to power them or parts to repair them became more and more difficult. Suddenly, in the middle of the modern era, farming with oxen became an important fact of life in Cuba. So it's this, you can't separate even an animal like an ox out of this much more complex tapestry of life on Earth. So I profiled this elderly man in Cuba
Mm.
who had farmed with oxen when he was a young man. And then, all the younger farmers had gravitated toward their tractors, but he never did. He was old fashioned and simply wasn't interested in tractors. And then lo and behold, suddenly he's in great demand because he knows how to run a team of ox. So it was a wonderful story, and maybe a perfect illustration of the ramifications of these stories, which really extend well beyond the margins of the pages.
Susan Orlean is our guest on this week's book show. The name of the new book is On Animals. It is published by Avid Reader Press. There are two specific stories that I would like to talk about. One is about Kiko and Free Willy, and this is one of the longer pieces in the book, and really one of the more fascinating stories because it is so complicated.
It's so complicated that it was something where you kind of need a timeline to follow Keiko's rather extraordinary journey. And it was a story that also touched on the issue of tameness and wildness and our touching urge to repatriate some wild animals back to the wild, even after we've captured them, and the folly that is involved in that. Keiko was born in the wild, as one would expect, in the waters off of Iceland, and he was captured when he was just 1 or 2 years old, so he was really a baby. Lived for a while in a small aquarium in Iceland and then was sold to an aquarium in Mexico City. So he was shipped to Mexico City, and he lived rather unhappily in Mexico City for a number of years in a very small tank with no other orcas. So he was all alone. And we know that whales are very social. So this was a kind of unhappy setting for him. In the meantime, in Hollywood, a script was being developed about a young kid who is sort of adrift in his life and befriends a captive orca and decides that his mission is to release this orca back into the wild. When the movie was being filmed, the producers needed to find an orca to play Willie, the whale in the movie. They looked around. There aren't that many orcas in captivity, and so they did their search and eventually came to this whale in Mexico City who was not terribly happy, but the aquarium was perfectly willing to let him be in the movie. So he starred in Free Willy as, talk about kind of resonant and meta storylines about a whale in captivity. And the movie was a huge success. In the real world, though, Keiko, unlike Willie in the movie, was not released from the aquarium and sent back into the ocean to live wild. He was still living in this aquarium in Mexico City. And there was a huge uproar after the movie came out that the producers had never anticipated, which they figured this would make people want to donate to whale conservation. What they didn't anticipate is that people would say to them, well, wait a minute, what happened to the whale who was in the movie? That specific whale. And where is he? And why is he still in captivity? Well, that began a multi-year journey that involved Keiko being shipped first to Oregon and then to Iceland, and a multi-million-dollar effort to enable him to be released to the wild and to live the rest of his days with his kin in the ocean. And it was a massive effort that many people would have said was doomed from the start. It's not that easy to release a captive animal back to the wild, particularly if they were captured when they were very young and they simply don't have the instincts and the skills to live wildly. And more important, in the case of Keiko, they may not have the desire anymore. They're used to being fed and they're used to people. Someone told me recently that she had worked on the set of Free Willy, and she said, oh, Keiko was the friendliest animal. He would come over and watch the crew as they were setting up their lights and cameras, and he was very attuned to people. So releasing him to the wild was an epic effort that went through many phases and had a lot of emotion and lots of money connected to it.
And one of the aspects of the story that really got me was you go through all of this, and the fact that they make this movie throws this animal into this quandary, and then when they decide to make a sequel, they're just going to do CGI.
Right. I mean, this is of course at the time they made Free Willy, I don't know that CGI in any sophisticated way existed. So it wasn't even animation obviously
Right.
existed, but the level of CGI that we can achieve now didn't exist. I mean, that movie came out a long time ago. I can't remember the release date, but it was probably 20 years ago. So CGI now, as we know it, is incredibly sophisticated, and anyone who's seen The Revenant can attest to the fact that it's terrifying to see a bear attack Leonardo DiCaprio, even when you know that it's a CGI bear, because it looks so real. At the time that this film was made, there also was less sensitivity to the issues of animal rights and the correct treatment of animals and issues around captivity. We've really evolved in our attitudes tremendously. It's a different different state of mind. And now that we can do some of these film treatments without using a wild animal, the reason to actually use a wild animal to perform in a film starts being more and more questionable. It's not that CGI is cheap. I don't know the dollar to dollar comparison, but I doubt it's cheaper to use
Mm.
CGI, but it removes all of the issues of, is the animal being treated fairly? Should a wild animal be held in captivity? And there's a strong movement to not ever keep any cetaceans like orcas in captivity, because many people feel that there simply isn't a way to keep an animal that large in captivity in a way that is humane. And my guess is that 10 years from now, there won't be any orcas in captivity, that the ones that are in captivity will have passed away, and there are not new ones being captured.
One of the stories that you tell is one of the most recent stories, and that is about the rabbit outbreak. It was a piece that you wrote for the New Yorker, and as you're telling this story, we are going through our own outbreak.
It was one of the reasons that I became so interested in writing about this rabbit pandemic. This was in the middle of COVID, and I hear offhandedly from my stepson, who has a pet rabbit, that the clinic that he takes her to in New York City had to be closed because of some viral outbreak. This is an era where all we are doing is thinking about viruses. The minute he said viral outbreak, I said, was it COVID? And he said, no, it was something that just affects rabbits. And I instantly thought, I've got to learn more about what this is, and also how uncanny that this is taking place in the middle of COVID. All of us were preoccupied with this idea of contagion and viral spread and the way disease multiplies in the public. And suddenly I'm seeing a mirror of it in this separate population of rabbits. And it really is a very devastating disease that's almost 100% fatal. And while you might think, oh, it's a couple of pet rabbits, what's the big deal? Well, that's not quite true. First of all, there are millions and millions of rabbits in the world. Many countries use rabbit meat for food very commonly. It's not so common in the US, but it's a very important food source in a lot of parts of the world. Secondly, and more chillingly, this virus has made the leap from domesticated rabbits, which are one species, into wild rabbits, which are an entirely separate species. And usually they don't share diseases. But in this case, unfortunately, the virus mutated enough that wild rabbits became vulnerable. And if you see wild rabbits being wiped out, then there's the cascade effect of foxes and hawks and all of the animals that use rabbits as their primary food source. They get affected. So it was such an interesting story, and very frightening. And it's still continuing unabated. There is a vaccine, but the vaccine is expensive. It hasn't been approved in the United States, and there's no way to distribute it to wild rabbits.
And there seems to be just a general, not disinterest exactly, but sort of a hands-off approach by a lot of the parties involved.
It's an attitude toward rabbits that is not the same attitude that we have towards dogs and cats, or even towards livestock like cattle and horses and chickens. Rabbits, what made this story so interesting to write about is that we have a more nuanced and complicated relationship with rabbits than to almost any other animal. They are the only animal that we keep regularly as pets that we also just as frequently eat or use for fur. I mean, when you think about dogs and cats, and we don't, in this culture, we don't eat dogs and cats, and we don't eat horses. And if someone says they have a rabbit, you can't assume that it's a pet that sleeps in their bed with them, or if it's an animal they keep out in a hutch and plan to use for meat. And I think there's also an attitude that rabbits are basically replaceable, that they
Mm.
breed so prolifically that, well, if it wipes out 1,000 rabbits, that's okay. You can get 1,000 more. We have a really different attitude towards rabbits than toward any other animal that I can think of. And that's what makes this story so interesting, because the vaccine for the rabbits is made by killing rabbits. That, almost perfectly crystallizes this complicated relationship we have to this particular species, that we on one hand have the impulse to save them, on the other hand we kill rabbits to make the vaccine to save other rabbits. So that's a pretty contradictory state of mind towards these animals. And it's no accident that rabbits are not officially considered livestock by the USDA, nor are they automatically, they're not covered by any of the laws that protect domesticated animals like dogs and cats.
Susan Orlean's new collection is On Animals. It is published by Avid Reader Press. We enjoy hearing from our listeners about our shows. You can email us at book@wamc.org. Sarah LeDuc produces our program. Bookmark us for next week. And thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue.